Show your support. Subscribe to the podcast. Hello, I am that British guy and welcome back to my podcast NXT Talk, and as usual we will be running through all things NXT ahead of Takeover Chicago. Just a quick reminder that next week's episode will be purely a predictions episode on the match card for Takeover Chicago. There won't be a kind of general going over of NXT taping, unless there is something completely extraordinary that happens that might need a quick mention, but I will try and feed that into the actual predictions for Takeover itself. Also, on the 26th of June on my YouTube channel, there will be a review of the first ever Takeover show that they did, where the NXT Women's Championship was fought for the very first time between Charlotte and Natalya. And finally, on the Sunday, the 17th, there will be a brief review podcast episode as well, just reviewing the matches and the event that was Takeover Chicago. But for now, let's jump into this week's NXT episode. And it was a strange one. There was, if we're kind of splitting it in halves, there was a very big distinction between elements that were kind of significant and kind of held sort of importance, not just for Takeover Chicago but for things going forward beyond that, and the other half seemed very inconsequential by comparison, really. There was also a large kind of gulf, if you like, between things from a championship side and a non-championship side, more sort of focused towards Chicago there, and just between the women and the men, really, as well. There was kind of a big difference in terms of how I feel things are for how things are shaping up on the men's side of things and how things are shaping up on the women's side. So let's start off with the men, and let's start off sort of towards the beginning of the week's show with TM61 winning a fairly kind of straightforward squash type match against a couple of jobbers, and then basically calling out the entire tag division. Now, I presume because they mentioned the War Raiders, I presume that's where this is heading. Whether that leads to a couple of singles matches and then a tag match, or they just have a couple of tag matches against each other, or maybe even just the one match and the War Raiders presumably beat them. That was really as far as I could see this thing going. I'm assuming to kind of give the War Raiders a leg up to challenging the Undisputed Era for the tag belts. I'm assuming, again, a lot of assumption here, that they will be the ones to dethrone the Undisputed Era for those tag belts, because recently there have been a lot of tag teams that just don't really feel on that same level. And this is kind of leading into the tag match for the belts at Chicago. Only Lorcan and Danny Burch really feel like kind of side characters to Pete Dunne, really. And the main focus in that kind of immediate feud is Pete Dunne and Roderick Strong because of what happened at TakeOver Philadelphia. It makes sense what happened there, and I'm not particularly upset with that. Obviously, there was a hint months ago that the Undisputed Era were trying to recruit Roderick Strong, and initially he turned them down and actually faced them at War Games with the help of Authors of Pain. And then obviously the injury to Bobby Fish has kind of caused problems, shall we say, for them as a tag team, causing Adam Cole to obviously work double shift at Philadelphia. And they've kind of got round that in the short term because of Roderick Strong coming in and tagging with Kyle O'Reilly. So that's not too much of an issue. But the main focus in that story is Pete Dunne and Roderick Strong. And obviously Pete Dunne won't be featuring in this. And Oney Lorcan and Danny Burch, they just don't feel like they're at the level where they really should be challenging for the belts. But the problem is, you had the Authors of Pain, obviously were also in that match at Philadelphia, and they've gone up to the main roster to do nothing. Sanity as well, one of the former champions, have also gone up to the main roster and not even appeared yet. Obviously it's been a year since DIY have broken up, so they're not in the picture anymore. You've got TM61, who have up until very recently basically been kind of enhancement talent. They were almost the tag equivalent of what Cassius Ohno has become, whereby the new guys face them and beat them to give them the first step up the ladder, if you like. So obviously their wins recently over the Street Profits and Heavy Machinery have kind of tried to elevate them back up again, but in doing that, I know they weren't particularly clean wins. That's not done a lot to help the Street Profits and Heavy Machinery. And I was really surprised still that Heavy Machinery were beaten by the War Raiders in the way that they were. It was quite emphatic, really. So they're kind of nowhere to be seen, and the only team with any kind of momentum at all are the War Raiders, but then they're only on every about 3 or 4 weeks still, and they're still very new to the NXT audience. I'm sure a lot of them will be aware of them from their War Machine days, but just in general, I feel like they kind of need to go through a team in a proper feud first. And presumably that's going to be TM61, but in them getting a couple of dirty wins over the Street Profits and Heavy Machinery, who aren't really at that same level if they've already lost recently to the War Raiders anyway, then they beat this jobber team. I'm not really sure where they're going with it, to be honest, unless they're planning on, when Tyler Bate is sort of up and fit and ready, to have him and Trent Seven come in and almost replace Lorcan and Birch, which will be a real shame for them. But yeah, it's a very odd one at the moment, and I just didn't really see the point of this, because presumably they're going to get destroyed by the War Raiders anyway. And do the War Raiders then win come Brooklyn 4? Because I can't see them facing the Undisputed Era for the belts and not winning, because that will completely kill any kind of momentum that should be there with them, because they're still so new. But on the flip side, because they are so new, should they be winning the belt straight away? I'm not entirely convinced they should be yet, but who knows. That then led into the match between Roderick Strong and Danny Burch, and towards the end that was just complete schmoz. Everybody else came down: Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Pete Dunne, and Oney Lorcan was there as well, just to kind of even up the odds. and because of distractions, Danny Burch decided to let go of the crossface and then gets pinned after a backbreaker, which kind of makes sense. But then the last image you get is the confrontation between Dunn and Strong, and then Kyle O'Reilly coming in and sort of saving him. And it then transpires that Kyle O'Reilly is kind of challenging Pete Dunne for the United Kingdom title. I think what I would have preferred to kind of encompass everyone within this storyline together and not just make it so heavily focused on Strong and Dunn is potentially a champion versus champion match between Dunn and Cole. Not necessarily for either belt or both belt or at all, just one-on-one match, champion versus champion, almost kind of a pride thing between the two of them. The only problem being that the Chicago card is completely full of matches already. It just seems odd that Adam Cole has won, whether he's injured or not, I'm not sure, but he seems to be pretty active and has appeared in a fair few matches since, and I believe is still working live events. But he wins the belt in the ladder match. He has a title defence against Oney Lorcan, and then is in that 6-man tag. And he's got nothing going forward for the first pay-per-view after winning the belt, which seems like a really odd way of trying to elevate this brand new belt that really has got still quite a lot of momentum and intrigue about it, and then not defending it on the first show after Takeover Philadelphia, which seems odd. It not only will it not be defended, it won't even be showcased in a match. And I think maybe a title versus title match between him and Dunn, it would have kind of fattened out this feud a bit more to just Dunn versus Strong, kind of bringing the rest of the Undisputed Era into the picture, and would have been quite a nice way of probably evening up the odds in terms of the Undisputed Era retaining the tag belts, but possibly Pete Dunne getting a win over Adam Cole, so that it wasn't all skewed towards the Undisputed Era. I'm not sure. But there we go. And also, with Chicago last year being the event where Dunn actually won the belt, it's a shame that, again, that belt is not going to be properly showcased 1 year on, when he has defended it pretty consistently throughout the year on various shows, including sort of shows like Rev Pro, and obviously on live events, appearing on the main roster, and defending it a few times on NXT as well. And that belt again will not be showcased at Takeover Chicago, especially with the second UK tournament imminent. Really, it seemed odd to not showcase both those belts. And see, my other gripe with this week's show as well, they were the two matches involving the guys, and there was a women's match which I'll get onto later when I talk about the women's division in general. But the only other bits and pieces, there was a kind of a weak hype package between Lars Sullivan and Aleister Black that does not make me invested in that match at all, and I think that's a real shame for Aleister Black's first title defence. I'm presuming he's going to retain it, because taking the belt off of him after, what is it, couple of months seems ridiculous. But again, he's virtually been a ghost since winning the belt. It's very, very odd. So yeah, that match has got absolutely no heat in it at all. And to be honest, if it were to open the show, I don't know if I would really be that bothered that it was. I mean, I don't think it will, because it's probably not hot enough. But I doubt it's going to close the show after, for the same reason. I think we'll probably see Velveteen Dream and Ricochet open the show, and Johnny Gargano, Tommaso Ciampa close the show again. And and I can understand why it did at Philadelphia, but I do think that the NXT title should be the main event, or at the very least, or I say at the very least, that's derogatory verbiage, shall we say, but it should be your main men's title or your main women's title finishing the show, because they are the pinnacle of those divisions. So if it's not going to be Shayna Baszler defending the NXT women's title, which I doubt they're going to be doing anytime soon, then it should be Aleister Black defending the NXT title, and I just can't see that happening again. And this is kind of the other split, really, of champion matches and non-champion matches. It's very strange, especially in the men's side of things, because obviously we've only got the one women's match at Takeover. Is the two matches that I'm bothered about from the men's side are the two matches that have no belt involved in them. It's almost like WWE and NXT are thinking, well, because these are title matches, that's kind of enough. That makes them important enough. That makes people invested enough, because, we might get a new champion. But because the result of both of those matches is fairly obvious, although I think the Ricochet Velveteen Dream one is probably going to be a Ricochet win, because it's his first singles match at a Takeover, and he could do with kind of cementing himself within the roster with a good win. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that I'm really excited for that match, and the build for that match has been really, really interesting and really well worked. But there hasn't been a belt in sight. Granted, there was mentionings of it from both of them, the fact that that's what they're here for. That's why Ricochet's turned up, and that's why Velveteen Dream doesn't think that he should be cutting the line, because he's kind of been paying his dues and putting in the hard work, and really this is his time now, and the spotlight's going to be on him and not Ricochet. So there's been kind of suggestions towards future title matches, and then obviously because of the loss to Lars Sullivan, that kind of elevated him into the match against Aleister Black, which I suppose you could argue, had they have won that match, then maybe they should have been in a triple threat with Aleister Black. But obviously that wasn't the way they wanted to tell the story, which is fine, makes perfect sense. But you've got a match there that people are really, really invested in, two competitors that people are really, really behind and really invested in, and there's not a belt in sight. And Gargano Ciampa, again, there's not a belt in sight. And that is probably the feud in the company at the moment. You've got the most over babyface and the most hated and despised heel, and there's not a belt in sight at all. Granted, Gargano got jumped by Ciampa after his last title match against Cien Almas, and then got jumped before his title match with Aleister Black and wasn't able to compete. But it's not like this is even a number one contenders match. It's not like one of them was a champion and got screwed by the other or anything like that. And Ciampa didn't cost Gargano the belt at any point, apart from when he got fired in that match against Almas. But that was kind of just a continuation of the match earlier in the year at Takeover Philadelphia. So yeah, and then you've got Black and Sullivan, who, yeah, that will be a match, I suppose, and it will probably be a bit clunky. I feel, as I said, sorry for Black. And then you've got Lorcan and Birch against O'Reilly and Strong, and yeah, I just can't see them winning the belts for the minute, because the Undisputed Era keep going on about how they've got all the gold at the moment, or certainly the majority of it. So that seems to be a long-term thing, and every now and then they're sort of pitching to try and get the UK belt as well, with obviously Strong before he joined, and O'Reilly now going for it, possibly that could be one of the things that Bobby Fish does when he first comes back, maybe, to try and get himself a belt as well. But yeah, you've got a very, very clear divide there. Now, if we flip over to the women's side of things, because I don't want this to kind of be me bemoaning everything that's happening on NXT. I do realise I kind of missed out the Gargano Ciampa bit at the end, but again, that was something that it was just sort of there. It didn't really add anything. I think that we're as invested as we can be with that feud now, and I hope we don't really see either of them on the Go Home show, because I don't see what else it's going to bring to that. They've both signed their contract, they've both handed them in, they've got attacks in on each other. Candice LeRae's tried to kind of break it up, has got caught up in the middle and is kind of leading them to it now. Right, let's just see the match now, please. We know that Gargano won the first one. We've got a stipulation for this one as well. Let's just see how the match goes. I don't really think any more needs to be done. But then on the women's side of things, we open up with Shayna Baszler coming out. And the previous week, she had her belt taken from her by Nikki Cross. And I was really, really annoyed to see that she walked out with the belt. Why not? Especially when Cross comes out afterwards anyway. And by the end of it, the belt is kind of laying in the ring and she kind of throws it to Shayna Baszler. Why not have Baszler come out without the belt? That gives her more of an incentive to be annoyed still with Cross, and rather than have a scuffle and then sort of announce it after the scuffle that they're going to have a title match, why not have Baszler call out Nikki Cross and say, "Oi, give me my belt back. If you really want that belt legitimately and properly, I'll fight you for it at Takeover Chicago. But for now, get out here and make sure you give it back." They can then have a bit of a scuffle, and whether Nikki Cross nicks it again and kind of goes into Chicago in ownership of the physical belt but not actually as a champion, which I think would be quite nice and is something we haven't seen for quite a while in WWE, and is always quite a nice little wrinkle in that story, or whether Baszler manages to kind of one-up Cross long enough to grab the belt and kind of make a run for it. But the promo was very good. The interaction between the two of them was very good. Clearly, Nikki's character, her kind of unhingedness, is kind of playing on Baszler, and she's not quite sure how to take her. She isn't it's not as clear cut as obviously things were against Ember Moon and Dakota Kai, where she knows what this person is, what they're capable of, what their strengths and weaknesses are. Because Nikki Cross is a bit out there and is a bit off the wall, Shayna Baszler clearly is kind of wary of her and potentially vulnerable to her, as we saw. So that adds quite an interesting layer to things. But yeah, it just really annoyed me, and it took me a while. It probably took me until Cross came out for me to then really kind of let that go, and kind of get back involved in what was going on with the interaction between the two of them. And I have since watched it back, and kind of with a more open mind, I did quite like what Baszler was doing at the beginning, but it was just weird. Like, you had the belt taken away from you last week and now you've got it again. Well, alright, show me how you got it back. But you didn't. She just turned up with it. What? Did the officials take it away from Nikki Cross? Did William Regal get involved? There was no... Unless it's been all over social media and I've managed to miss it somehow. But then you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing on Twitter or on their website or anything like that, because that annoys me anyway. Because what's the point of having a weekly broadcast if you're not going to show all the elements on the weekly broadcast? Or if you are going to do that during the week, show it at the very beginning of this week's episode of NXT, so that if you've missed it, you're then up to speed with what's going on. But they didn't do that. So she just walks out with the belt, and I'm left thinking, well, how did she get it back? When did that happen? It really annoyed me. But that aside, I'm really looking forward to this match. But I still think it's a damn shame that Nikki Cross isn't up on the main roster with the rest of Sanity, and she should be. But there we go. It should still be a very good match. She put in one hell of a match against Asuka for the belt, which I think was her last title match, in a last woman standing match, which was just on normal NXT taping. It wasn't even on a takeover show, so that was a shame. But I think that was her last title match, unless she was in that fatal 4-way match at War Games, but I don't think she was. But please correct me if I'm wrong, because I may very well be there. Now, the flip side to things on the women's side, we had a very good match between Lacey Evans and Kairi Sane, and this was billed as kind of the rubber match between these two. Kairi Sane winning the first one, and Lacey Evans winning the second one fairly recently. And because of targeting Lacey Evans's hand and arm, and also mistiming off a very athletic way of getting into a moonsault from Lacey Evans, jumping facing into the ring on the middle ropes, up to the top rope and twisting round so that she's then facing out of the ring into a moonsault that unfortunately meant that she face planted the ring. That was kind of Kairi Sane's in then to sort of fire herself up to finally win the match. And just the way that Sane opened the match, all fire, the way that Lacey Evans dominated the middle section, and well, probably the middle and the beginning of the end, shall we say, of the match, dominating her. Again, I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, in a slow, methodical way, and although normally when you say slow and methodical, that's kind of a kind way of saying it was boring, it really wasn't. And it wasn't last time, and it wasn't again this week as well. It was just really precise. It was really intense. It was really aggressive. It was really controlled. But it was at quite a methodical pace. But you felt like it was planned that way, because she just wanted to remain on top and deal as much damage and pain and injury to Sane as possible. And she did that. There was even a point where she was pinning Sane with her fist up against Sane's side of her face. Almost like how Pete Dunne does with his own face when he's kind of taunting with the belt in his mouth. Lacey Evans was doing this to Kairi Sane's side of her face. She was forcing her face into the mat as she was pinning her. That kind of control and that kind of domination over her was really, really good to see. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with Lacey Evans and her character, because she seems to have her character perfectly at the moment. She understands exactly what her character is. She understands exactly what her character would and wouldn't do, what she would and wouldn't say, how she would behave in certain situations, how what she's done in previous matches led into this one as well. It was a really nice continuation of that, which led Kairi Sane to kind of target Lacey Evans's right hand, which she's calling a woman's right, which is brilliant. And she even said that she's got a right hand, or a woman's right, as she said, with Kairi's name on it, and even wrote Kairi's name on the back of her hand, which was brilliant. And that led Kairi to target the hand. And she picked up the win because Lacey wasn't able to hit her finisher, the woman's right. And again, I've said this before the last couple of weeks, I can really see this leading towards Kairi Sane versus Shayna Baszler. Presumably with Baszler winning the first match to make it 1-on-1 or 1-1-1 between the two of them because of the Mae Young Classic final, and then potentially properly leading into a rubber match between the two of them at the next Takeover taping. Whether that is then when Baszler drops the title or not, I'm not sure, or whether they kind of keep it on her for the long term, I'm not sure. But Sane's firing up, the crowd really get behind her, and I haven't seen someone get fired up in that kind of visceral way for a long time, and she was very hot in this in terms of that, her fire and her aggression towards the end, because she knew how dangerous Lacey Evans could be, because she'd learnt from the previous match and it led into this, and it was really well done. But again, that's not involving the belt. It's not going to lead into a title match in the immediate future. I hope it does in time, but who knows. We shall see what happens either after the women's match, if anyone comes out to challenge Baszler, or possibly the week after. We shall have to wait and see, I suppose. The only other thing I wanted to mention is, again, Cassius Ohno is being fed to a new guy. This time it's going to be EC3. There was a short backstage thing between the two of them, setting up a match for next week. So we all know which way that's going to go. And yeah, I just feel really sad for Cassius Ohno, because he's just stuck playing the Dolph Ziggler character of new guy comes in, faces Ohno, beats Ohno, first step up on the ladder. Great. And he's losing more credibility with each defeat. And yeah, it's just really getting him nowhere, when considering he should have been in the original lineup of the Shield and could possibly have been a world champion by now. And he's not even been the NXT champion, and he's still stuck there after being released and being brought back in. But sorry to end on a downer, but that was just something I'd realised I'd kind of missed. But there we go. That was this week's NXT. It was a shame that we're kind of on a bit of a downward trajectory. It kind of felt a bit like a filler week before Takeover. I'm hoping that next week's isn't the same, but as I said, next week's podcast will be solely a predictions podcast, going through the card for Takeover Chicago and giving you my thoughts as to who I think will win and why, and kind of developing that further towards sort of Brooklyn 4. But until then, please check me out on my YouTube channel, That British Guy. As I said, there will be a review on the 26th of this month for the first ever Takeover show. There will also be a new Raw After episode on the 12th of June, looking at what happened on the Raw after King of the Ring 96, after Austin wins and gives his now famous Austin 316 promo. And also, please, you can follow me on Twitter at Rightly Wrongly, and also find me on Facebook, That British Guy 86. But until next week, I have been That British Guy, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.